Move, old lady. That seat is mine." Those 5 words dropped into the air of Gate 22 like a stone through still water, and every single person within earshot went completely still. The way people go still when something happens that is so wrong. It takes a moment for the brain to process that it is actually happening, and not something imagined. But we are getting ahead of ourselves because the morning had started quietly the way mornings do before they become something you remember for the rest of your life. Dorothy Mae Caldwell arrived at Gate 22 of O'Hare International Airport at exactly 6:17 in the morning, which was 2 hours and 23 minutes before her scheduled flight to New York, and she arrived that early, not because she was anxious or uncertain, but because she had learned long ago that the best seats go to the people who show up before anyone else decides to want them. She was 76 years old, small in the way that some women become small over the decades without ever becoming diminished, with white hair that she kept neat without fussing over it, and a pale lavender scarf tied loosely around her neck that she had owned for so many years. It had softened into something that felt like part of her. She carried a handbag, the old-fashioned kind in dark brown leather, structured and sensible, the kind that closes with a satisfying click and holds exactly what needs to be held and nothing more. She wore her glasses on a thin silver chain, and her left hand, when she was not actively using it, held a very slight tremor that she had simply incorporated into her life the way you incorporate a persistent hum in the walls of a house you have lived in long enough to stop hearing it. The gate area was already filling up when she arrived, the early crowd of business travelers and anxious families and red-eye survivors who had not quite slept enough, all staking their claim on the limited real estate of plastic chairs arranged in rows under fluorescent lights that made everyone look approximately the same shade of tired. Dorothy moved through the space without hurrying, without hesitation, and found what she was looking for: the chair at the end of the far row, right against the floor-to-ceiling window that looked out across the tarmac where the planes were still sleeping in the gray pre-dawn light. It was the best seat in the gate, and she had known it would be available this early because she had been doing this long enough to understand that the best seats always go to the people who arrive before anyone thinks to compete for them. She sat down, settled her handbag on her lap, and reached inside with practiced ease to retrieve a small sheaf of papers that she had folded carefully along precise lines. They were printed on plain white paper with no letterhead visible, just columns of numbers and narrative summaries in a font small enough to require her to lean forward slightly as she read. She uncapped a ballpoint pen and began reading with the focused attention of someone for whom these numbers were not abstract, but lived, breathing things she had spent decades caring about. From behind the counter at the gate desk, a young woman named Priscilla Huang was arranging the morning's boarding documentation. When she glanced up at the arrivals in the gate area, the way gate agents develop a habit of scanning the room without really seeing individuals, just the general shape of the crowd. And then her eyes paused on Dorothy in the corner seat, and she looked at her screen, and then looked back at Dorothy, and then looked at her screen again, and for just a moment her hands stopped moving over the keyboard before she quietly turned the monitor a few degrees toward herself and resumed her work without saying anything to anyone. Dorothy did not notice. She was reading, and she was making small notations in the margins, and the gate was filling up steadily around her, the noise level rising the way it does in airports as morning shifts into day, and the departure board above the desk had just updated to show a 40-minute delay, followed 20 minutes later by an additional hour and 20. Dorothy looked at the board, noted the new time, and returned to her papers. She was not worried. She already knew about the delay. She folded the papers back along their creases, tucked them into the handbag, and clicked it shut, then looked out the window at the tarmac where the ground crews were beginning their morning routines, small figures moving between enormous machines in the pale light, and she thought about her granddaughter Layla, who was in New York right now, who would be standing in the arrivals terminal later today, and who had no idea just how much the world her grandmother had built without telling anyone about it. Brad Whitfield walked into Gate 22 at 7:45 in the morning, which was an hour and 28 minutes after Dorothy, moving with the forward momentum of a man who has never had to wait for a room to make space for him, because rooms have always made space for him without being asked. He was 44 years old, 6'2", with hair so platinum blonde it caught the terminal light in a way that made people glance twice combed back from a face that was handsome, in the particular aggressive way of men who have been told they are handsome since they were young and have built a certain amount of their identity around the confirmation of that fact. His suit was navy blue and expensive in the way that expensive suits announce themselves without saying a word, and his shoes were the kind that require regular professional maintenance to look the way they looked. On his right wrist, he wore a Rolex that he had bought himself after his company's first significant contract, not because he needed to tell time with precision, but because he had decided at 31 that he was the kind of man who wore that watch, and he had been right about it in the specific way that men who are very good at reading social signals are right about things like watches. He was ending a phone call as he came through the gate entrance, his voice loud enough to be heard over the ambient noise of the terminal. The clipped and commanding voice of a man who had spent so many years talking in conference rooms, where he was the most important person present. That volume and authority had become the same thing to him. "Listen to me," he was saying. "Morrison doesn't know what he's talking about, and he never has. So pull the contracts and call me back in 20 minutes, and I mean 20 minutes, not whenever you feel like it." He ended the call without a goodbye. He never said goodbye on the phone. Goodbyes were for people who had time to perform pleasantries, and Brad Whitfield had decided somewhere in his late 30s that he did not have that kind of time. His phone buzzed as he pocketed it, and he glanced at the screen long enough to read a text from his younger brother Thomas. "Hey, catching you before the week gets crazy. I'm in back-to-back Meridian meetings all day. Let's grab dinner in New York after your flight lands." Brad scrolled past it without replying. The name, Meridian, registering as a piece of information he would address later when there was something that required addressing, and looked up to survey the gate area with the practiced efficiency of a man who has passed through hundreds of airport gates and has learned to extract from each one whatever it can offer him. His gaze moved across the rows of occupied seats, calculating, assessing, and stopped on the corner chair against the window where Dorothy was sitting with her handbag on her lap and her eyes turned toward the tarmac outside. The chair was exactly what he wanted. Corner position, natural light enough distance from the crying baby 2 rows back to make phone calls without competing noise, and the open wall space on the left where he could set his carry-on without it becoming a tripping hazard for passing strangers. It was in every measurable way the optimal seat in the gate area, and Brad Whitfield had long ago adopted the working principle that optimal things belonged to people who recognized their value and acted on that recognition without hesitation. He was not thinking about the woman in the chair as a person. That would come later when he would have a great deal of time in a Delta business class seat to think about what he had and had not seen. But right now he was thinking about the chair, and the woman was simply the current obstacle between himself and what he wanted in the same category as a full parking lot or a slow elevator. He walked over and stood directly in front of her, close enough that his shadow fell across her lap, and said in the voice he used when he wanted to convey that a conversation was a formality before an outcome that had already been decided, "Excuse me, I think there might be a mix-up here. That's actually my seat." Dorothy did not look up immediately. She finished the thought she was in the middle of the way a person finishes a sentence before acknowledging an interruption, and then she raised her eyes to look at him. And those eyes behind her glasses were not watery or uncertain or deferential, but were the pale, particular gray of deep, still water on a cloudy day, sharp in the specific way that takes decades to develop. "I don't believe we've met," she said with the careful precision of someone who understands that every word in a sentence has weight. "So, I'm not sure how this could be your seat." Brad blinked once. He had not expected that particular sentence. He had expected polite confusion or apology or the immediate gathering of belongings that usually followed when he presented himself with sufficient certainty. He had not expected Dorothy May Caldwell to look at him and answer like someone who had been answering questions like this for 50 years. "I always sit in the corner," he said. "When I fly, I need the corner. It's quieter over here for calls. Dorothy looked at the empty chair directly beside him. She looked back at him. There's an empty chair right there, she said, and her voice held no sarcasm and no challenge, just the simple observation of an obvious fact being offered to someone who appeared to have missed it. What Brad Whitfield did not know, what none of the 51 other passengers in Gate 22 of O'Hare International Airport knew, was that Dorothy Mae Caldwell had been in airports like this one for her entire adult life, and that the calm she wore so naturally was not the calm of someone who did not understand what was happening to her, but the calm of someone who understood it completely, had understood it for decades, and had arrived at a place in her 76 years where the understanding no longer required her to perform either anger or fear. She had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, the daughter of a woman who cleaned other people's houses and a man who repaired other people's cars. And she had learned arithmetic at her mother's kitchen table because the school she was zoned for did not have enough textbooks to go around, and her mother had decided that was unacceptable. She had gotten herself to a state university on a scholarship that required her to work 2 jobs to supplement it, and she had graduated with a degree in business accounting at 22 and immediately discovered that the accounting firms in Birmingham in 1970 were not particularly interested in hiring black women regardless of their grades, and she had filed that information away alongside everything else she had filed away in her life. The stores where salespeople followed her, the restaurants where she waited too long, the banks that found reasons to decline, and she had gone to work for herself. She had met Harold Caldwell at a church business meeting in 1974 when he was 30 years old and already dreaming about something bigger than the charter flight company he had been running out of a converted garage for 3 years. Harold was the kind of man who could see a complete structure in his mind before a single foundation stone was laid, and Dorothy was the kind of woman who could look at a financial projection and know in her bones whether the numbers were honest or wishful. They got married in 1976, and they built Meridian Airways together in a way that meant neither of them could have built it without the other. And when they were turned down for funding 11 times in the first 2 years, Dorothy kept the books, and Harold kept flying, and they both kept going because going was the only option they had decided to give themselves. The name of the airline had been Harold's idea. Meridian, he had told her one night at the kitchen table with papers spread everywhere between them, is the line that runs through the highest point. That's what we're going to be. She had told him that was a very grand ambition for 2 people who currently owned 1 airplane and owed money to their church. He had smiled and said, "I know." And he had been right. Harold died in 2019, a Tuesday morning in March, and Dorothy had sat with the loss, the way you sit with the loss of someone who has been your whole working world for 43 years, which is to say she sat with it incompletely for a long time, finding pieces of it she hadn't known were missing, still sometimes reaching for the phone to tell him something before remembering. She had not sold her shares. She had not restructured the board. She had appointed Avery Nash as CEO, a woman she had watched work for 17 years and trusted entirely. And she had said to Avery in the first week, "I am going to be quiet. I am not going to be gone." Avery had understood the distinction perfectly. The papers in her handbag were the 3rd quarter operations report for Meridian printed without letterhead, which Dorothy reviewed every quarter on her own time, and twice a year she chose a route and bought a ticket under her maiden name, Caldwell, and flew like an ordinary passenger on someone else's airline to see what ordinary looked like from a seat that wasn't hers. She kept notes. She paid attention. It was the most important work she did all year, she had always believed, and Harold had agreed with her. Today's flight was United, not Meridian. She was flying to New York because her granddaughter Layla was graduating from Columbia Law School tomorrow morning, and Dorothy had promised Harold at the end, quietly holding his hand in the hospital, that she would be in the front row for every graduation that followed, until she physically could not be, and she had kept that promise twice already, and intended to keep it now. Layla did not know the full size of what her grandmother had built. She knew there was a company knew the name Meridian knew in the vague way of a young person whose grandparent has always simply seemed capable of anything that her grandmother was not a small person. But she did not know the number 31%, and she did not know what $2.3 billion looked like from the inside of a modest house in Birmingham, with a garden that needed tending. Dorothy had decided long ago that this was how she wanted it. Some things you carry alone, not because they are too heavy to share, but because carrying them alone is part of what makes them yours. The gate area at 7:50 in the morning was the particular kind of crowded that airports produce when a flight has been delayed twice and the passengers have passed through frustration into the resigned fatigue that lies on the other side of it, where people have stopped actively checking the board and have instead committed to their small territories, a chair, a phone charger on the wall, a square foot of floor beside their luggage, and are waiting with the patience of people who have run out of other options. Renata Wells was sitting 3 chairs away from Dorothy, which was close enough that she had heard every word of the quiet exchange between Dorothy and the platinum-haired man in the navy suit, though she had not interjected yet because Renata had spent 31 years as a high school English teacher in Chicago and had developed a fine-tuned instinct for knowing when a situation required intervention and when it required witness. And right now, it required witness. She was 58 years old, with natural hair going silver at the crown and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she was traveling to New York to see her daughter, who had just had her first baby 3 weeks ago and was finally ready for visitors. Renata had a paperback mystery open on her knee, but she had not turned a page in the last 4 minutes. Gary Pollard was sitting 2 rows diagonally behind Dorothy, working his way through a sandwich he had bought at the Terminal Deli at 6:30, because he had learned over decades of travel that airports cannot be trusted to feed you at reasonable intervals, and it was better to arrive with provisions. He was 67 years old, retired, going to New York to see his daughter's new apartment, wearing a flannel shirt and carrying a carry-on that had a national park sticker on the side from a trip he had taken with his late wife 12 years ago and had never removed because he saw no reason to. He was not by nature an intervening kind of man, but he was by nature an observing kind of man, and he had been observing Brad Whitfield since the moment the man had walked in talking on the phone, loudly enough to make the baby across the aisle startle. In the 3rd row back, Priya Suresh, 24 years old, a graduate student in communications, was not exactly filming the gate on purpose, so much as she was running a slow ambient recording on her phone, the way young people in her field did in public spaces. A kind of ongoing documentation of ordinary life that she reviewed later to find the moments that turned out not to be ordinary at all. The phone was in her lap, angled upward, the screen dim but live. She was wearing headphones, but only had one earbud in because she did not like to be fully removed from the world around her. At the desk, Priscilla Huang had finished the immediate organizational tasks of the morning and was now managing the queue of passengers with rebooking questions and upgrade requests, the steady, low-grade administrative chaos of a delayed flight being absorbed into a day that had not planned for it. She was 29 years old and had been a gate agent for United for 4 years, long enough to know the difference between a routine morning and a morning that was going to generate paperwork. When Brad Whitfield had walked to her desk earlier with his request about the seat, she had explained the policy with the professional steadiness she had cultivated over 4 years of delivering news that passengers did not want to hear, and she had watched him walk away with the phone to his ear. And then she had turned back to her screen and done something that none of the passengers in the gate area noticed. She had looked at Dorothy's booking information one more time, and then she had typed a brief internal message to her floor supervisor and sent it without making it visible to the passengers at the counter. The floor supervisor had read it and forwarded it upward, which was the kind of thing that happened silently in large organizations when a name in a system triggers a protocol that no ordinary traveler would ever know existed. None of this was visible in the gate area. The gate area just looked like what it always looked like at this hour, tired people waiting for a flight. Brad Whitfield was coming back from the desk now, and his jaw was set in a particular way, and everyone who was paying attention could see that the conversation was not finished. Brad Whitfield returned to the space in front of Dorothy's chair with the particular energy of a man who had been told no by a counteragent and had decided that the no was a procedural obstacle rather than a final answer, which in his experience it usually was because the right combination of persistence and status could move most procedural obstacles if you applied them correctly. "Look," he said, and his voice had shifted from its earlier transactional tone into something that was still technically civil but had the quality of civility being used as a container for something less civil underneath. "I understand you've been sitting here for a while and I respect that, but I have calls that I cannot miss, and this is the only part of this gate that's quiet enough for me to make them properly. There's a perfectly good seat right there." He pointed to the empty chair beside her. "You'd actually be more comfortable over there because you'd have more space on your left side." Dorothy looked at the empty chair. She looked at Brad. She looked at the empty chair again with the expression of someone genuinely examining a suggestion before responding to it. "I have been sitting in this chair since 6 this morning," she said in a voice that was not raised and not heated, and contained no apology whatsoever. "I chose it because I wanted it. I would like to continue sitting in it." Brad put his carry-on down on the floor beside him with a soft, deliberate click that was slightly louder than it needed to be. "I have a board meeting in New York that I cannot be late for," he said, the volume increasing by 1 degree enough to be noticed by the people immediately around them without being what anyone would call shouting. "I'm not asking for much. I'm asking for one seat that happens to be in a location I need for professional reasons. And I'm telling you," Dorothy said with the same unhurried evenness, "that I was here first, and I intend to stay." Renata Wells turned a page in her book that she was not reading. Gary Pollard set down the second half of his sandwich on his knee. Brad's approach shifted again the way it shifted when direct request wasn't working into a mode that was more performative, more conscious of the audience around them, as though he were filing a complaint with the gate area at large, rather than talking to Dorothy specifically. "I fly 200 times a year," he said not loudly but clearly. "I know how this works. I know what business travel requires. I'm asking for a reasonable accommodation, and I'm being refused by someone who is apparently determined to be difficult." "I'm not being difficult," Dorothy said. "I'm sitting in a chair." Renata Wells closed her book. Not conspicuously, not with any announcement, just closed it and set it on her knee and looked at Brad Whitfield with the attentive, steady regard of a woman who has spent 31 years watching young people perform the particular theater of entitlement and knows every scene by heart. Gary Pollard had stopped pretending to eat. He was watching with the focused stillness of a man who has not decided yet whether to say something but is actively moving toward that decision. In her lap, Priya Suresh's phone was still recording. The camera had slowly, without any deliberate movement, found a better angle. Brad looked around at the faces that were turning toward the conversation, and he performed the calculation. He always performed in public situations, reading the room for leverage and support, and found less of both than he usually found, which meant that the crowd was not the asset he needed it to be, which meant the next move had to be different. He went back to the desk. He pulled out his phone and made a call to a regional manager he knew from a golf event, a man named Patterson who had given him his card 2 years ago and said to call if he ever needed anything smoothed over on a United flight. He spoke for 3 minutes, his back partly turned to the gate, his voice low but pointed. He came back wearing the particular expression of a man who has made a call that he believes has changed something. "I just spoke with regional," he said to Dorothy. "Someone is going to come and ask you to move." Dorothy held his gaze without answering. She was not anxious. She was not bluffing. She was simply waiting, and there was something in the quality of her waiting that was more unsettling than any argument she could have made. No one from regional came. The minutes that followed had the quality of a storm gathering in the kind of careful increments that make you wonder afterward at what exact point the sky changed, because when you are inside it, There is never a single moment you can point to and say, there that is, when it became something different. It just becomes something different while you are watching it. Brad Whitfield stood in the middle of the gate area with his phone in his hand, and the expression of a man whose reliable mechanism had just failed to produce its expected result, and he was recalibrating in real time the way people recalibrate when the tools they have always used suddenly don't work, not by questioning the tools, but by applying more force to them. He went back to Priscilla's desk for the second time, and this time his approach was different, sharper, the patience worn thinner now so that what was underneath it was closer to the surface. "I need you to understand something," he said to Priscilla, in the voice he used when he wanted the person across from him to feel the weight of the conversation. "I am a Diamond Medallion member. I spend more than $40,000 a year with this airline. I have been a loyal United customer for 16 years, and I am standing here in your gate asking you to do one simple thing, and you are telling me that you cannot do it." Priscilla Huang looked at him with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally unimpressed and said, "Mr. Whitfield, I understand your frustration, and I genuinely appreciate your loyalty to the airline. But seating in the gate area is open seating, and I am not able to ask another passenger to give up a seat they are occupying regardless of their status or mine. That is the policy, and it applies to everyone, including our most valued customers. Then get me someone who can override the policy. The policy doesn't have an override for this specific situation, sir." Brad looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at his phone, and then he looked back at her. "I'm going to be filing a formal complaint," he said. "I want your name and employee number." "Of course," Priscilla said, and she wrote her name and employee number on a small slip of paper and handed it across the counter without any indication that this had rattled her in the slightest, because it had not. Brad walked away from the desk with the paper in his hand, and Priscilla waited until he was back in the seating area before she turned to her screen and, with the practiced quietness of someone who has been waiting to do something specific, sent a second internal message. This one going not to her floor supervisor, but directly to the duty manager for Terminal C, and the message contained 3 things: Dorothy May Caldwell's booking name, the nature of the incident developing at Gate 22, and a notation that read, "Per protocol NR7, please confirm." She did not let her expression change when she sent it. She went back to processing the rebooking requests in her queue. In the gate area, Renata Wells had quietly shifted her bag to the other side of her chair to make a small additional space around Dorothy that was not a fortress, but was something, a gentle reconfiguration of proximity that said, without saying it, "I am on this side of things." "You doing all right?" Renata asked Dorothy, and her voice was low enough that it was a private question in a public space, the way you speak to a stranger when you have decided they are not quite a stranger anymore. "I am fine," Dorothy said. "Thank you for asking." And then, after a pause, "This kind of thing has a way of sorting itself out." Renata looked at her with the slight, particular attention of a woman who has heard a sentence that means more than it says. "I expect it does," she said. Gary Pollard had put his sandwich entirely away now. He was sitting forward with his forearms on his knees watching Brad Whitfield pace a tight line near the windows with his phone to his ear again, and he had the look of a man who has seen enough and is deciding whether the moment has come. Priya Suresh was no longer pretending to be doing anything other than what she was doing. The phone was still in her lap, but she was alert present, aware that she had footage of something that was still unfolding and that the unfolding was not finished. Brad ended his second call and stood still for exactly 3 seconds, which was the length of time it took for him to calculate that the next move could not be the same as the last 2 moves, because the last 2 moves had produced exactly nothing. And then he turned and walked back toward Dorothy with a deliberateness that the people watching him recognized immediately as the deliberateness of someone who has moved past persuasion and arrived somewhere else entirely. He stood in front of her for the 3rd time. His voice when he spoke had gone quiet in a way that was worse than loud. "Last chance," he said. "Move now." Dorothy looked up at him, and then she did something that nobody in that gate area had expected. She smiled small and steady and entirely undefeated, the smile of a woman who has been here before and is still here. "No," she said. What happened next took less than 4 seconds, and those 4 seconds were the ones that changed everything. Brad Whitfield reached down and closed his hand around Dorothy's left wrist, the hand that always trembled, its small, quiet tremor, and pulled upward with the firm, decisive motion of a man removing an obstacle. Not roughly in the way of intentional cruelty, but in the way of someone who has decided that the conversation is over and action is now required, without asking himself for even 1/2 of 1 second what it means to put your hand on an elderly woman's body, as though her body is a thing you have the right to move. Dorothy's glasses flew from her face and skidded across the terminal floor, the silver chain spinning behind them, and her handbag lurched sideways off her lap, and she reached for it with her free hand and caught it, but the motion was urgent and unplanned, the motion of a person trying to hold the things that are hers, while someone else tries to move her without her consent. Her wrist, where Brad's hand had been for those 4 seconds, bore the faint but real impression of his fingers. The sound of the glasses hitting the tile was not loud. It was, if anything, small, but it landed in a gate that had gone completely silent in the fraction of a second between Brad reaching for Dorothy and the glasses hitting the floor. And in that silence, the sound of those glasses was the loudest thing that had happened all morning. Every person in Gate 22 who had been watching went completely still. Priya Suresh's hand tightened on her phone and her thumb moved to go from ambient recording to live streaming, and she went live without making any announcement, and the viewer count in the first 30 seconds was 4, which became 40, which became 400, which was still becoming when everything else was happening. Renata Wells was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand up. She had taught high school for 31 years, and she knew better than almost anyone what happened in the bodies of people who witnessed someone smaller and older than them being grabbed by someone larger. And she was standing in the space between Brad and Dorothy before Brad had finished processing what he had done, and her voice was not a shout, but it had the carrying quality of a voice that has spent decades projecting across rooms full of people who weren't listening. "Did you just put your hands on her?" It was not a question. It was an accounting. Gary Pollard was also standing, and the sandwich bag fell off his knee, and he did not notice it at all, because he was looking at Brad Whitfield, with the uncomplicated directness of a 67-year-old man who has decided that the moment has come. "Hey," he said, and then louder. "Hey, what are you doing?" Brad had taken 1 step back. His hand was at his side. He was looking at Dorothy with an expression that was not quite what anyone would have predicted, because it was not triumphant and it was not exactly guilty. And it was something in between those two things that had no clean name. The expression of a man who has just done something and is watching the consequences begin to arrive before he has finished deciding what he thinks about what he did. Dorothy did not cry. She did not shake or knot beyond what her left hand always did. She sat with her handbag held against her and looked at the floor where her glasses were. And then, with movements that were deliberate and unhurried and contained no fear, she leaned forward, picked up her glasses, breathed on the lenses, wiped them on the corner of her lavender scarf, and settled them back on her face. She looked up at Brad Whitfield. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The look was the sentence, and the sentence was one that people who witnessed it would describe differently depending on who they were, but the common element in all their descriptions would be the word quiet, the specific kind of quiet that is not the absence of power but the absolute command of it. "I barely touched her," Brad said to Renata, to Gary, to the gate at large, to whomever might still be persuadable. "I was trying to help her stand up. She was being completely unreasonable, and I simply—" "You grabbed her arm," Renata said. "We all saw it." "That's not— I have it." Priya said from her seat, and held up the phone so the screen was visible, the little red live indicator glowing in the corner, and it's streaming. At the gate desk, Priscilla Huang pressed 2 buttons in sequence. The first was the button that connected her to the floor supervisor. The second was a button behind the desk panel that most passengers do not know exists, a direct line to the duty manager that is reserved for situations that have escalated past the gate agent's individual authority to manage, and she pressed it with the calm efficiency of someone who has been waiting for the right moment and has recognized it. She said very quietly 2 sentences into the line, and then she released the button and clasped her hands on the desk in front of her and looked at the gate area with the expression of someone who knows that the next few minutes are going to be different from everything that came before them. Brad attempted to manage the crowd the way he managed most things that had gotten complicated, which was to assert a version of events with enough confidence that the version became the agreed-upon one, and it had worked for him in boardrooms, and it had worked in mediation, and it had worked at country club dinners, and it had worked in situations that objectively should not have worked for him because he was good at it. Genuinely. Technically good at the particular skill of framing reality in ways that served him. But the gate area at O'Hare was not a boardroom, and the people in it had eyes, and they had just watched what they had just watched, and every attempt Brad made to reframe it crashed against the simple fact that 60-something people had seen a man put his hand on a 76-year-old woman and pull, and no arrangement of words was going to redirect what those eyes knew. She refused a reasonable request, Brad said, and his voice was still trying to do the thing voices do when they want to sound like the reasonable party, the wronged party, the man who was actually the victim of the unreasonableness of others. I asked her politely multiple times to move to an equivalent seat. She refused. I was running out of time and options, and I reached out my hand, and it was not what you are making it look like. We're not making it look like anything, Gary Pollard said, and there was nothing loud or theatrical about the way he said it. Just the flat weight of a man in a flannel shirt who had decided he was finished watching and started speaking. It looks like what it is. A woman in the gate area, mid-50s, traveling alone with a large rolling suitcase, said from 4 rows back. Why don't you just take the other seat? Which was not the most profound contribution to the moment, but had the quality of sensible clarity that cut through the noise. I had every right to Brad started. Man. A young man, maybe 25, on the other side of the gate, leaned forward in his chair with his forearms on his knees and looked at Brad with an expression of tired and uncomplicated disgust. Just stop. It was not a complicated sentence. It was 4 words, the simplest possible version of what the room was thinking, and it landed with the specific weight that simple, true things land with when an entire room is thinking them simultaneously. Brad was quiet for a moment, not because he had run out of words, but because the room had stopped being the kind of room where words produced the result he needed, and he was recalculating the situation in real time, looking for another angle, another lever, another path through. Dorothy was sitting in her chair upright, handbag in her lap, hands folded over the clasp, not watching Brad, not performing composure for the audience, simply present the way she had been present for the entire morning, and her phone was now in her right hand, open to her contacts, and her right thumb rested on a name at the top of a very short list. The name on the screen was a Nash Quiet Line. She typed 6 words. She did not look at Brad when she did it. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at the screen typed and pressed send, and then she placed the phone face down on her knee with a quietness that looked like nothing and was everything. At the desk, Priscilla Huang received a reply to the message she had sent to the duty manager, and she read it twice, and then she looked at Dorothy, and then she looked at her screen again, and the expression on her face shifted with the particular precision of someone who has just understood something that changes the weight of every prior moment. Brad looked across the gate at Priscilla, caught her eye, spread his hands in a gesture that said, "Help me do something, this is getting out of control." Priscilla looked at him with a neutral steadiness that told him absolutely nothing, and he realized with a cold and creeping certainty that neutral steadiness was not the same as being on his side. Renata Wells had remained standing. She was not between Brad and Dorothy now because Brad was no longer approaching, but she had not sat back down, and she was not going to sit back down, and her standing was a kind of statement that required no words. The baby that had been crying on the far side of the gate had finally gone quiet, and in the quiet, the sounds of the gate were the ordinary sounds of 50-something people in a space they were sharing uneasily, the shift of bags, the clearing of throats, the soft, persistent sound of Priya Suresh's phone recording everything. Brad pulled out his own phone and dialed a number. The call did not connect the way he expected it to. The man he called said, "I saw the video, Brad," and said nothing else, and Brad looked at his phone and looked at the gate around him, and something in his face did a thing it had not done in a very long time. It came apart slightly just at the edges in the way of someone who has just seen clearly for a moment what they actually look like from the outside. Captain James Okafor had been standing near the service corridor entrance for 11 minutes. He had come through the side door on his way to a pre-departure conversation with the ground crew chief when he had caught the edge of the raised voice from across the gate area, and he had stopped walking. The way a person stops walking when the thing they hear is not ordinary airport noise, but something with a different quality to it, something that requires attention rather than filtering. He had watched. He had listened. He had remained where he was because there is a difference between a situation that needs a captain and a situation that is still resolving itself through the ordinary processes of people and time, and for 10 of those 11 minutes, he had believed he was watching the latter. The moment Dorothy's glasses left her face was the moment he began walking. He was 51 years old and had been flying for United for 28 years, which meant he had seen every variety of human behavior that the specific pressures of air travel could produce in people. And he had developed over those 28 years the particular composure of someone whose job requires them to be the calmest person in any room. Not because they feel no urgency, but because they have learned that urgency expressed incorrectly costs you the room. He walked into the space at a pace that was not hurrying, and was not slow the pace of someone who has identified where they need to be and is going there without the performance of rushing. And he positioned himself in the open area between Brad and Dorothy and Renata, and when he spoke, his voice was the voice he used at 35,000 feet when he needed every person in the cabin to hear him clearly without hearing alarm. "Sir," he said, looking at Brad. "I'm Captain Okafor. I understand there's been a situation here involving a passenger." Brad looked at the uniform and processed what it meant: authority, institutional weight. Someone who could potentially be recruited to his side, and his posture adjusted accordingly, the aggressive tension in his shoulders softening very slightly into something more collaborative. "Captain," he said, and there was a thin veneer of relief in the word. Relief that someone in an official capacity had arrived who might finally understand that he was the reasonable party in this. "I'm very glad you're here. This woman has been refusing a simple request, and things have gotten out of hand, and I just need someone with actual authority to." "I heard," Okafor said. "I've been standing over there for about 10 minutes. Brad stopped. Something recalibrated behind his eyes. "Then you saw—" "I saw what I saw," Okafor said, and neither his tone nor his expression gave Brad any information about whether what he had seen was going to be useful. He turned to Dorothy, and the shift in his expression was the single degree of warmth that could be read by someone paying attention and missed by someone who was not. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Dorothy looked up at him. "I'm fine," she said. He grabbed my wrist. My glasses fell. Okafor's gaze moved briefly to the floor where the glasses had been, then to Dorothy's left wrist, then back to her face. Then it moved to Brad, and it held there for a moment with the quality of evaluation that pilots develop the quick, precise reading of a situation's actual state, as opposed to the state someone wants you to believe it is in. "I barely touched her," Brad said before Okafor spoke. "She is significantly overstating what happened. I reached for her arm to help her up and He yanked her forward, Gary," Pollard said from his row, and his voice was not heated, just factual, the tone of a man reporting what his eyes had recorded. "We saw it." "I have the video," Priya said. Brad looked at Priya with an expression that shifted in the space of 1 second from dismissal to something considerably less confident. "That's taken completely out of context." Mr. Okafor waited. "Whitfield?" "Brad Whitfield." "Mr. Whitfield, I need to ask you to take several steps back from this passenger right now and remain in that position while I assess the situation." He said it with the exactness of a man for whom sentences like this are not rhetorical. Brad looked at him for one long moment that contained several things simultaneously: the instinct to push back the calculation of whether pushing back was viable, the slowly arriving recognition that the room had a shape he had not correctly mapped when he walked into it this morning. He took 3 steps back. Renata Wells watched this and said nothing. There was nothing that needed to be said. Okafor turned back to Dorothy and crouched slightly to be closer to her eye level, and when he spoke to her next, it was in the register of a private conversation taking place inside a public one. "Is there someone I can call for you? Someone who should know about this?" Dorothy looked at him with those gray eyes and the almost smile that was not quite a smile. "I already sent a message," she said. "It's been received." Okafor looked at her for just a moment longer than the words required, and something moved across his face. Not surprise, exactly, more like the particular recognition of a man who has just noticed that the situation he walked into is deeper than it appeared from the outside. He straightened up. He pressed the radio on his collar. He spoke 3 sentences too quietly for anyone to hear. While Captain Okafor was making his low, quiet radio call and Brad was standing where he had been told to stand, with the rigid posture of a man who has not yet decided whether he is going to comply or resist, Dorothy May Caldwell was doing something that she had done every time in her life when a person had looked at her and seen something that was not her. She was watching them very carefully. Not with hostility, and not with the performed patience of someone swallowing what they actually feel, but with the genuine steadiness of a woman who has spent 76 years observing how the world works, and has long since stopped being surprised by its mechanics while maintaining the capacity to be affected by them. She had met Brad Whitfield before. Not this specific man with his platinum hair and his Rolex and his Houston office, but this type of man, this particular configuration of certainty and blind spot, the man who walks through a world that has never seriously disappointed him, and therefore has no mechanism for recognizing when he is disappointing the world. She had met him in the person of the bank officer who had leaned back in his chair in 1981 and explained to her and Harold with genuine and cheerful condescension that the airline industry was not a viable space for a venture of their particular background. She had met him in the investor who had shaken Harold's hand at a conference and said, looking at Dorothy, "And you're the what?" The assistant. She had met him in the airport in 1994 when a man not entirely unlike Brad had asked her 3 times if she was certain she was in the first-class lounge and not the Delta Sky Club 2 gates down. Harold had a saying about men like this, which was that the most dangerous thing was not a man who hated you, but a man who had simply never bothered to see you. Because hate at least required acknowledgement, while invisibility left you with nothing to work against. Harold had been a man of great generosity who had also been a man of great precision, and he had known the difference between those 2 things when most people around him did not. Brad's phone buzzed again in his pocket, and he looked at it without moving from his position, a reflex he could not suppress, and Dorothy could see from the angle of his face that it was a text rather than a call, and she could not read it, but she would learn later that it was the second message from Thomas that day. Meridian meeting just got weird. "Call me when you land." Brad looked at the screen, looked up at the phone back in his pocket. The name Meridian had not yet connected to anything that mattered to him. It was a meeting his brother was in. It was a name on a building. It was background noise in a day that was already too loud. Dorothy looked at her own phone, face up on her knee, and saw that the message she had sent 18 minutes ago to the top of her contacts had been read. There was no reply yet, which meant Avery was gathering information before responding, which was what Avery always did, and why Dorothy had trusted her to run Meridian for the last 5 years. She thought about Layla, who was in her apartment in the Bronx right now, probably having coffee before heading to the airport to wait for Dorothy's arrival. Layla, who had called 3 weeks ago at 11 at night to talk through a decision about an internship, and had talked for 40 minutes, and then said, "Sorry, Grandma. I've been talking the whole time. How are you?" And Dorothy had said, "I'm good, baby. I was listening, that's why you called," and Layla had gone quiet in the specific way of someone who has just realized something simple and important. Layla did not know about the 31%. Layla knew the name Meridian, the way you know the name of a place that matters to someone you love as a word associated with your grandmother's life, with your grandfather, who had died when Layla was a junior in college, with something that was important in a general way that you had not yet made specific. Dorothy had considered telling her many times. She had always decided against it, not because she wanted to keep it from Layla, but because she believed that people should know the truth about the people they love when the truth adds something, and she had not yet identified what adding this particular number would add that was not already there. She looked at the tarmac through the window at a small ground crew vehicle moving in a slow arc between 2 parked aircraft, and she thought today might be the day the truth adds something. Brad Whitfield had spent his professional life in situations that required him to control the narrative, and he was very good at it, not dishonestly, not through fabrication, but through the particular art of framing, of choosing which facts to present in which order and at what volume, so that the story that emerged from the available evidence was always the story that served him best. The problem he was encountering in Gate 22 was that framing requires a gap between the event and the audience's perception of it, and in this case there was no gap because the audience had been present and was continuing to be present and had formed their perception in real time without any intermediary. And there was a young woman with a phone who had been capturing the entire thing and who was at this moment showing the viewer count to the woman sitting next to her, and it was a number that started with a comma. He stood in the position Okafor had assigned him and looked at the shape of the situation around him with the eyes of someone who has just realized that the exits are not where they appeared to be. And he made a choice that was not the choice he would have made if he had been calmer or rested, or if he had not already spent the morning losing at every turn, which was to make one more attempt, one more push, one final bid to reframe the room in his favor. And he chose his words the way a man chooses words when he is frightened, and covering the fear with aggression. "I want everyone to understand something," he said, and his voice was too loud, now stripped of the veneer of professional composure, and operating from a place that was rawer and less controlled, and every person in the gate heard it, and every person in the gate went very still. "I have been in this gate for almost an hour. I have been told by multiple people that nothing can be done for me. I have been filmed without my consent. I have been talked down to by strangers. And all of this because a woman?" He looked at Dorothy, and the look contained something that had moved past frustration into something uglier, something that reached for the oldest, most reflexive category of dismissal. Decided that her comfort was more important than my time. And because apparently in this day and age, if you're the wrong kind of person making a reasonable request, you get treated like the problem. The gate went silent in a way that was different from the previous silences, a denser silence, the kind that means a line has been crossed that cannot be uncrossed. Renata Wells said, "Wrong kind of person." She repeated the phrase in the flat tone of someone holding it up to the light for the room to see. She was sitting in a chair. That's all she did. I didn't say, "You did say," Gary Pollard said. "We all heard it." "All 278 of you," Priya said. And she said it quietly, more to herself than to Brad, but the number carried. Brad looked at her. "That's—" He stopped. A man in his 30s, 3 rows back, who had not spoken once in the entire hour, said in a completely ordinary voice as though he were noting the weather dude, "Stop talking." The woman next to him nodded once. The young mother with the baby, who had been managing the crying child for the entire morning, with the focused and exhausted attention of someone running on not enough sleep, looked up from her child's face and looked at Brad Whitfield with an expression that held nothing specific and everything general. The expression of someone who has seen this before in shapes she carries privately, and then she looked back at her baby. Dorothy said nothing. She had said nothing for the last 8 minutes, and her silence in this chapter of the morning was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of someone who understood that she did not need to say it, that the room was doing the work that needed to be done, and doing it without her, and she only needed to remain exactly as she was, 76 years old in her chair, upright with her lavender scarf and her handbag, and her left hand doing its quiet, trembling thing at her side. Captain Okafor had been watching Brad's second speech with the particular attentiveness of a man who has just arrived at a decision he had been approaching incrementally. He pressed his collar radio again. This time he spoke for longer, and what he said into it changed the morning. Priscilla Huang at the desk received a message in her earpiece. She read it. She looked at her screen. She looked at Gate 22 as a whole. The crowd of exhausted, delayed passengers, the standing women, the standing man, the man with the platinum hair who had just said the wrong thing in front of 300 people, and the small woman in the lavender scarf who had not moved from her chair. She made a decision, and she picked up the phone on the desk and she dialed. Avery Nash was in her office on the 31st floor of the Meridian Airways headquarters building in downtown Chicago when Dorothy's text arrived on the private line, and she read it twice in the way she always read things from Dorothy, not because Dorothy was unclear, but because Dorothy was precise in a way that warranted reading twice. Gate 22. O'Hare. I need you. In 5 years of running Meridian, Avery had received 11 messages on the quiet line. 9 of them had been informational, the kind Dorothy sent when she had observed something on a flight that needed attention and wanted Avery to know about it before the internal reports caught up. 1 had been a check-in from an airport in Memphis during a ground delay that had gone 6 hours. And the first one, had been sent on the day after Harold died when Dorothy had written, "I'm going to need some help figuring out what comes next." That message had been the beginning of everything that came after. I need you was different from the informational messages, and Avery moved on it the way she had learned to move on things that Dorothy flagged, which was immediately and completely. She called back. The call went to voicemail. Dorothy was in the middle of something. Avery called the operations desk at O'Hare and told the duty manager who she was, and asked for any incident reports open at Gate 22 in the last hour. There was one. The passenger name in the victim field was Dorothy M. Caldwell. Avery recognized the Caldwell immediately. It was the maiden name Dorothy traveled under, so she would not be recognized. A habit she had maintained since the early days of the airline, when she and Harold had decided that the point of the mystery shopper approach was to remain a mystery. Avery called her head of legal, a man named Robert Fitch, and told him what she knew, and told him to have camera footage from Gate 22 pulled for the last 90 minutes. Then she called her deputy operations director and said, "I'm going to O'Hare. Cover me." In a conference room on the 23rd floor of the same building, 2 floors below Avery's office, Thomas Whitfield was sitting across from 2 Meridian contract development managers and a senior procurement officer, and they were halfway through a presentation about the logistics partnership that Whitfield Supply Group had been building toward for the better part of 18 months, a partnership that Thomas had worked toward with the quiet and methodical care of a man who understood that relationships of this size were built over years and maintained through consistent attention. His phone was face down on the table per the meeting protocol he had agreed to when he sat down. He had been checking it in small, brief glances when the Meridian people were speaking, and the third time he checked it, he saw a notification that made him go very still. His brother's face captured at an angle on a video that was loading in a Twitter preview. The caption above the preview said, "Viral businessman assaults elderly woman at O'Hare, gets entire flight canceled." The video had been retweeted 14,000 times, and the number was still moving. Thomas excused himself from the table. He stepped into the hallway. He opened the video. He watched 38 seconds of it and stopped, not because he needed to see more, but because he had seen enough, and he stood in the hallway outside the Meridian conference room with the phone in his hand and the sound of his own breathing and the particular cold and specific quality of a situation that you have not caused but are now inside regardless. Through the glass conference room door, he could see the Meridian procurement officer looking at something on her laptop, and then, quietly, with a professionalism that Thomas recognized because it was the same professionalism he used when he needed to be measured in a moment that was not turning the laptop toward her colleague and pointing at the screen. Thomas looked at his phone. He looked at the conference room. He looked at the caller ID that was now lighting up his screen. It was Avery Nash, the CEO of Meridian, calling him directly, not through the scheduling system, but directly from her personal cell. He answered. "Thomas Avery," said, and her voice had the quality of someone who is being careful because they know what they are carrying is heavy and breaking it would help no one. "I need to ask you about something, and I need you to be completely straight with me. The woman at O'Hare this morning. In the video." Thomas closed his eyes. "That's my brother," he said. There was a pause on the line. "I know," Avery said. Another pause. And in that pause, Thomas could hear what it contained, which was every month of work, every meeting, every carefully maintained relationship, every handshake that had led to the point where he was standing in a hallway in a Meridian building with a contract almost in hand, and he could hear all of it recalibrating around a video of his brother grabbing an old woman's arm over an airport chair. "Avery," he said. "We'll talk," she said. "I have to go to O'Hare." The line went quiet. Thomas stood in the hallway for 30 seconds, and then he opened his contacts and dialed Brad, and the call rang 7 times and went to voicemail. And he did not leave a message because there was nothing a voicemail could hold that was adequate to what he needed to say. At 8:31 in the morning, which was 9 minutes before the revised boarding time that the departure board at Gate 22 was currently showing, Priscilla Huang received a message in her earpiece from the duty manager for Terminal C that contained 3 things: a confirmation, an instruction, and a name that she had already suspected for the last 40 minutes. She absorbed all 3 pieces in the time it took to blink, and then she picked up the desk phone and made a call, and the call lasted 45 seconds, and when it was finished, she stepped out from behind the counter for the first time all morning. She walked to where Captain Okafor was standing, which was still between the seated crowd and Brad Whitfield, and she spoke to him in a voice too low to carry past the 2 of them. And she watched his face as she spoke, and she saw him absorb what she was telling him with the same quality of stillness she had come to associate with him, the stillness of someone whose composure is not armor against information, but a method of receiving it clearly. He asked her one question. She answered it in one sentence. He nodded. He looked at Brad. He looked at Dorothy. And the way he looked at Dorothy was different now in a way that was not performance or deference, but was the specific quality of recalibration, the look of a man who has just been given a piece of context that reorders everything that came before it. Brad had not stopped talking. He had been managing a phone call for the last 6 minutes that he believed was going somewhere useful, and which was not going anywhere useful, and he was now in the middle of a sentence about customer relations errors. When the speaker system above Gate 22 crackled, once the short preparatory crackle, that means something official is coming. And then came the voice, unhurried and flat and professional in the way of someone doing a job without editorializing. Attention passengers at Gate 22. United Flight 1147 to New York LaGuardia has been canceled due to an operational matter. All passengers please proceed to the customer service desk for rebooking. We apologize for the inconvenience. The gate erupted. Not in the dramatic way of people screaming, but in the dense, chaotic way of 52 people processing a piece of information that none of them were prepared for, and all of them had immediate practical problems with the noise of schedules being broken and connections being lost, and plans that had been constructed around the assumption of this particular flight no longer having a foundation to rest on. Chairs scraped, bags were grabbed, voices collided and layered over each other in the particular frequency of airport panic, which is distinct from other kinds of panic, because it is almost entirely logistical rather than physical, a panicking of calendars and obligations rather than bodies. Brad Whitfield did not move. He stood where he had been told to stand carry-on beside him, phone lowering slowly from his ear to his side, and he went through the colors that a face goes through when a man who has never in his adult life been confronted with an irreversible consequence of his own making. Suddenly is the red of fury, the pale of shock, and then the gray that comes when a person understands on some level that they have crossed into territory from which the usual tools cannot extract them. He turned to Captain Okafor, and his voice had everything stripped from it, except something that was trying very hard to still be outrage, and was succeeding less well than it was trying. "You did this," he said. "You canceled this flight because of a seat." Okafor looked at him with the patience of 28 years. "The flight was canceled pursuant to protocol regarding a disruptive passenger incident," he said. "It is a duty manager decision, not mine. I reported what I witnessed. The decision was made above my authority." "You reported." Brad stopped, restarted. "You know what this costs me. I have people in New York waiting for me. I have Mr. Whitfield," Okafor said, and the particular weight of those two words, the way he said them, contained a gentleness that was somehow worse than severity. The gentleness of someone who is not enjoying what is happening. "I would encourage you to contact our customer service team as soon as possible to discuss your options for rebooking. That is what I am able to offer you right now." Brad looked past Okafor at Dorothy, who had not risen from her chair, who had not joined the surge toward the desk, who was simply sitting in the corner by the window with her handbag on her lap and her glasses on her face and her left hand resting at her side. And she was looking at something outside at the tarmac, at the ordinary mechanical world of ground crews and fuel vehicles and the slow, patient work of keeping planes moving, and she was not looking at Brad at all. He had expected her to look at him. He did not know why he had expected it, but he had, and her not looking at him was in its own way the most significant thing that had happened to him all morning, because it meant that whatever he had thought this was about whatever he had thought was at stake between them had existed entirely on his side. She had simply been sitting in a chair. The rebooking line formed with the particular organic chaos of a crowd that knows it needs a line but has not yet agreed on where it begins, and Priscilla and her colleague were already behind the desk with their hands on their keyboards before the last echo of the announcement had faded. Because this was the part of the job where preparation mattered most, and Priscilla had been preparing since 6:17 that morning. Brad Whitfield was not in the line. He was standing 15 feet from the desk with his phone pressed to his ear, making the kind of call that only works when you are the most important person in the conversation, and the man on the other end of the call was not cooperating with that premise because the man on the other end of the call had already seen the video. Okafor had stepped to one side near the service corridor door and was maintaining a position from which he could see the full gate area the way a person maintains a position when they have decided the situation is not yet fully resolved. Dorothy was still in her chair. The woman who had come to stand beside Dorothy, Renata Wells, had sat back down next to her after the announcement, and they had exchanged a few quiet words, and now they were sitting in the particular companionable silence of two women who have been through something together that requires a moment of stillness before the next thing. At 8:43, Avery Nash walked through the gate entrance. She was 48 years old, medium height, wearing a gray suit that she had put on 2 hours ago for a day that had not included O'Hare, when she woke up and she moved through the crowded gate area without rushing and without hesitation. The way people move when they have been in crowded spaces their entire career, and understand that movement is more about intention than speed. She had a badge on her lapel that said Meridian Airways Executive Office, which most of the United passengers would not parse for significance, and she carried nothing except her phone. She found Dorothy before she found the gate desk, before she found Okafor, before she assessed the situation in any professional capacity, because Dorothy was the reason she had come and everything else was secondary. She sat down in the chair that Renata had vacated by shifting one seat over, and she leaned toward Dorothy and she spoke in the private register that had characterized their entire working relationship across 5 years and dozens of quiet conversations. And when she saw Dorothy's left wrist, she reached out and very gently with one finger moved the sleeve of Dorothy's coat back 1 inch to look at what was there. The bruising was developing into 4 clear marks on the pale inner wrist, and Avery looked at them for exactly as long as she needed to, and then she settled Dorothy's sleeve back down with a care that was entirely personal and had nothing to do with airlines or percentages or anything except the specific and uncomplicated fact that someone she loved had been hurt. "I'm all right," Dorothy said. "I know you are," Avery said. "I'm not." Brad had ended his phone call and was now standing in the line for rebooking, not because he had decided the line was his best option, but because it was the only option left, and he was watching the gate area with the alert eyes of someone trying to understand the landscape they are now in, as opposed to the landscape they thought they were in when the morning started. He noticed the woman in the gray suit sitting next to Dorothy. He noticed the badge. He felt the cold, specific feeling of a piece of information arriving that he was not going to like, and he watched the 2 women talk, and he walked out of the line, and he walked toward them because he was at his core a man who moved toward things rather than away from them, and sometimes that quality served him, and sometimes it was the exact thing that made everything worse. "Excuse me," he said. Avery looked up at him with the even assessing regard of someone who has been told exactly who she is looking at. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, and the fact that she knew his name without being told registered in his face as something between confusion and the beginning of real dread. "I'm Avery Nash. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Airways." Brad looked at the Meridian badge. He looked at Dorothy. He looked back at Avery. "What does Meridian have to do with this?" Avery held his gaze. "Sit down, Mr. Whitfield," she said. "This is going to take a minute." He did not sit down, but something in him went very still, the way things go still when a person senses that the ground they are standing on has just changed, and they are not yet sure in what direction or by how much. Dorothy looked at the tarmac. Outside, a Meridian Airways aircraft, navy blue with a white stripe along the fuselage, was taxiing slowly toward its gate, unhurried, certain of its direction, and Dorothy watched it for a moment with the expression of someone watching something that contains their whole life in its movement. Then she turned back to Avery. "Tell him," she said quietly. And Avery told him. They were standing in a quieter corner of the gate area, the 3 of them, Okafor a few feet away in case he was needed. The rebooking crowd, a different noise from a different world. And Avery spoke in the measured and precise way she spoke when she needed every word to land in the right place. "Dorothy May Caldwell," Avery said. And she said the name, the way you say a name you want someone to hear completely, is the co-founder of Meridian Airways. She and her husband, Harold, built the airline from 1987. Harold passed in 2019. Dorothy retained her equity position. She currently controls 31% of the company's outstanding shares. Brad looked at Dorothy. Dorothy was looking at the window. Meridian Airways. Avery continued is the primary code share and operational partner for United Airlines on 17 routes in the Midwest under an agreement that has been in place since 2021 and is currently in its renewal review period. The renewal meeting is happening this week. I was in Chicago for it. She let that sit for one beat. I left that meeting to come here. Brad said nothing. The math was beginning to move through him the way cold water moves when it finds the places where there is no warmth. Whitfield Supply Group. Avery said has a pending logistics contract with Meridian filed in September, currently in final review. The contract value is $4.7 million over 3 years. She looked at him directly. Your brother Thomas was in our offices this morning for a presentation related to that contract. Brad closed his eyes. Just for a second. Just enough. I want to be clear about something, Avery said, and her voice was still level, still precise, not unkind and not cruel. The voice of someone who believes in accuracy as a form of respect. I am not telling you this to threaten you. I am telling you this because I want you to understand what you didn't see this morning when you looked at this woman. She glanced at Dorothy, then back at Brad. You saw an obstacle. You saw an old woman in a seat you wanted. You didn't look further than that, and so you didn't know. But I need you to understand now that your not knowing doesn't change what you did. It just makes the consequences of what you did more visible. Brad looked at his hands. They were the same hands they had always been. I didn't, he started. You grabbed her wrist, Okafor said quietly from where he stood. He had not moved. He was simply adding a fact. Brad was quiet for a long moment. The gate noise continued around them, 50 people conducting the urgent business of people whose plans have been disrupted. And in the middle of all that noise, this small corner of the gate had the particular acoustics of a conversation that is happening at a different frequency. The contract, Brad said, finally, and his voice had gone to a place that was smaller than it had been all morning, stripped of the performance he had been maintaining since he walked through the entrance. Is it on pause? Avery said. Pending the outcome of today, my brother worked on that for 18 months. I know, Avery said. I've worked with Thomas for nearly 2 years. He is careful and he is honest and he has represented your company well. She looked at Brad with something that was not exactly compassion, but was something in its direction, the look of a woman who has seen enough of the world to understand that the person in front of her is not the first, and will not be the last to arrive at this particular moment of recognition, and who does not enjoy the moment but believes in its necessity. He's also the reason you had a seat at that table, and he's the only reason I'm telling you all of this directly instead of through lawyers. Brad's phone buzzed. He looked at it. Thomas. He sent it to voicemail. He looked at Dorothy, who had been sitting through this entire conversation with her handbag on her lap, and her eyes mostly toward the window and her left hand trembling its quiet, constant tremor. Mrs. Caldwell, he said, and his voice had the quality of someone speaking in a language they do not have fluency in, but are attempting honestly. I didn't know who you were. Dorothy turned and looked at him fully for the first time in the last 15 minutes, and those gray eyes were absolutely clear and absolutely direct, and she said something that he would hear later alone in a hotel room in New York, where he had eventually managed to rebook a flight when he was replaying the morning the way people replay mornings that change them. She said, I know you didn't. That's the whole problem. And then she turned back to the window, and Avery sat down next to her again, and Okafor quietly positioned himself elsewhere, and Brad Whitfield stood in the gate area of O'Hare International Airport, with his carry-on at his feet and the Rolex on his wrist and the weight of a morning he could not undo settling over him with an accumulation that was entirely new to him because it had no mechanism he recognized for lifting it. Priya Suresh looked at her phone screen, and the number she was reading had a comma in it, and then 2 commas, and the number was still climbing. She had gone live at the moment Brad's hand had closed around Dorothy's wrist, and in the 2 hours and 11 minutes since then, The video had been clipped and shared and reshared across platforms, in the way that videos travel when they contain something that a very large number of people recognize without needing to be told what they are looking at, something that lands not in the political part of the brain, but in the older, simpler part that responds to the image of a large person grabbing a small one and says wrong. The clips had titles now given by the people who shared them. "Old Woman Refuses to Give Up Airport Seat Watch. What Happens?" And "He Grabbed Her." The entire gate went silent, and the most widely shared one, which was 18 seconds long and contained only Brad reaching for Dorothy's wrist, the glasses hitting the floor, and Dorothy's face as she picked them up and put them back on. No caption, no title, no commentary. Just the footage. The footage was enough. The Chicago Tribune had called. CNN had called. A producer from a morning news program had sent a direct message to Priya's public account. The group chat in which her sister had first shared the clip now had 847 unread messages. Brad's phone had 14 missed calls. 7 of them were from numbers he did not recognize, which in the context of his current situation meant journalists. 3 were from his assistant in Houston, whose messages had gone from routine to urgent, to a single text that said, "Please call me as soon as you possibly can." 1 was from Marcus Chen, the chairman of the board for a company Brad sat on. 1 was from the general counsel of Whitfield Supply Group, and 1 was from Thomas, which Brad had sent to voicemail. The Tribune article had gone live at 9:14 a.m. 43 minutes after the cancellation announcement, while Brad was still in the gate area, under the headline, "Businessman Identified in Viral O'Hare Video Shows Altercation with Elderly Passenger." The article was brief and factual and used his full name and his title and a photo taken from the Whitfield Supply Group website that had been up there for 3 years. His company's phone had been ringing since 9:20. Renata Wells had not left Gate 22. She was rebooking, waiting in the line patiently, and while she waited, she had called a friend who worked at the Tribune, not to give a statement, but to say, "I was there, I saw everything, I want to make sure the story is right," and her friend had taken notes for 20 minutes. Gary Pollard was in the line, too, a few spots behind Renata, and he had already provided a written statement to the gate supervisor, which he had done in the careful and complete way of a man who has spent 30 years in contract law and knows what a written statement should contain and how to construct one. From across the gate area, Brad looked at Dorothy one final time. She was standing now accepting a cup of tea that one of the other gate agents had brought her, and she was talking with Avery Nash and with Priscilla Huang, and the 3 women were in a conversation that had the quality of people who have moved past the incident and into the practical, the what comes next, the how do we make this right. Nobody in the conversation was looking at Brad. He understood, standing there with his carry-on and his phone full of calls he was not ready to make, that the story of this morning was not going to be told from his perspective. The story was going to be told from the gate, from the 52 witnesses, from the video that was currently being embedded in articles on 3 continents, and from the woman in the lavender scarf who had sat in a corner chair by the window and had not moved and had not needed to do anything other than remain exactly who she was. He booked the Delta flight on his app. Business class aisle seat, there were no window corner seats available. He picked up his carry-on and began walking toward the gate exit, and he walked without looking back, because there was nothing behind him that he was ready to look at, only the long walk through the terminal toward the next flight and the board meeting and the reckoning that was going to be waiting in New York at the end of all of it. He did not look back, but in the moment before he turned the corner into the main terminal corridor, he heard something rise from Gate 22 behind him. A sound that started with one person clapping steady and deliberate, and then a second, and then a dozen, and then more than that, the particular sound of a crowd choosing finally at the end of a long morning which side they were on. He kept walking. Brad reached Thomas on the fourth attempt 20 minutes after he had left Gate 22, standing in a relatively quiet alcove near a Hudson News in the main terminal corridor, his back against the wall and his carry-on between his feet and the noise of the airport moving past him like water around a stone. Thomas picked up on the second ring and said, "I've been trying to reach you," and his voice had the texture of someone who has been sitting with something for 2 hours and has used that time not to get angrier, but to get quieter, which is in its own way worse. "I know," Brad said. "I saw your calls. I watched the video," Thomas said. "I watched all of it." Brad didn't say anything. There was nothing in the first few seconds that seemed adequate. "You grabbed a 76-year-old woman over an airport chair," Thomas said, "and he said it the way you say something that you need the other person to hear, not as an accusation but as a fact, as a thing that happened in the world that now exists independently of intention or context." "Brad, I have been watching the video for 2 hours and I can't find the version of that where it makes sense." "I was frustrated," Brad said. "The delays, the calls the whole morning." "I know," Thomas said. "I can see you were frustrated. The whole country can see you were frustrated." "That's the problem." Brad was quiet. "Avery Nash called me," Thomas said. "Before she went to the airport. She told me she was going to O'Hare because of the incident. At the time, I didn't know what the incident was. I was sitting in a conference room full of Meridian people, and my CEO called me to say she was going to deal with a situation involving a passenger." He paused, and then I looked at my phone and found out that the passenger was the woman in your video. And then I found out who that woman is. "The Meridian connection," Brad said. "No," Thomas said, and there was something sharp and immediate in the word, the sharpness of a man correcting a misunderstanding he finds insulting. "Not the Meridian connection. Dorothy Caldwell. That woman. Who she is, Brad. Not what her stock percentage is." He took a breath. "She's 76 years old and she built a company from nothing, and she was sitting in a chair she had every right to sit in, and you put your hands on her and told her to move." "I know," Brad said, and his voice was quieter than it had been at any point in the morning, quieter than it had been when he was performing civility, and quieter than it had been when he was performing outrage. Quieter in the way that things are quiet when there is nothing left to perform. "I know what I did. The contract is on pause," Thomas said. "Avery told me." 18 months, Brad. 18 months of meetings and relationship building and presentations and everything that went into getting to the point where we had a signed term sheet on the table. And you in one morning in one gate over one chair. He stopped. "I'm not going to yell at you. I don't have the energy for it. I just need you to understand that what you did today is going to cost people other than you. It already has." Brad leaned his head back against the wall of the terminal. Above him, the departure board showed a Delta flight to JFK departing in 52 minutes. Around him, the airport continued its indifferent operation announcements, rolling luggage the specific frequency of a public space that has no investment in the emotional states of the people passing through it. "I'm going to fix it," Brad said. "You can't fix it," Thomas said, not unkindly. "You can address it. You can do the work that comes after doing something wrong. But the thing itself is done. It's on video. It's in the Tribune. It has a number of shares attached to it that I stopped tracking because the numbers stopped meaning anything when it got large enough." Another pause. "The Meridian contract may or may not survive this. I genuinely don't know. What I do know is that whether it does or it doesn't is going to depend on what you do in the next few days, and the first thing you do needs to have nothing to do with Meridian or contracts or money." "I'll apologize," Brad said. "Not to me," Thomas said. "I didn't lose anything today that I can't rebuild. She's the one who needs to hear from you, and not through lawyers and not in a settlement. You personally." Brad said nothing for a long moment. Out the window of the terminal, a plane was climbing steeply into the October sky above Chicago, getting smaller with each second, until it was just a shape among clouds, and then nothing visible at all. Meanwhile, Susan Holloway, the United Airlines head of customer relations for the region, had found Brad 20 minutes earlier and had delivered in the professional and unhurried manner of someone whose job includes the delivery of very bad news. The formal notification that his Diamond Medallion account had been flagged pending a conduct review, that the incident report had been filed with the airport authority, that there was a TSA notification requirement for physical contact incidents with other passengers, and that United's legal team was available to him as a courtesy, which was a courtesy he would shortly need. Brad had listened to all of it. He had not interrupted once, which Susan noted internally because in her 11 years of doing this, she could count on both hands the number of times a passenger like Brad Whitfield had listened to the full notification without interrupting, and it meant something, though she was not sure yet what. He had taken the card she offered. He had said very quietly, "I understand." And then he had walked to this alcove with his carry-on and his phone, and the beginnings of something that was not yet remorse but was in its neighborhood. Something that had the quality of a man who has spent a long morning refusing to look at something, and has finally with great difficulty looked. The first-class lounge at O'Hare was quieter than the gate area, as lounges tend to be designed for the specific purpose of providing respite from the particular quality of noise that accumulates in public terminals, and Priscilla Huang had walked Dorothy there herself after the rebooking chaos had reached its peak, not because Dorothy had asked for it, but because Priscilla had decided it was the right thing to do, the way some people in positions of small authority manage to identify the right thing to do, and then simply do it without waiting for instruction. Avery sat across from Dorothy at a small table near the window, and the two women had been talking for 40 minutes, which was different from the conversations they usually had because their usual conversations were about the company operations, governance decisions that needed to be made. And this one was quieter and more personal. The kind of conversation that happens between two people after something hard when the professional categories fall away and what's left is just two people who respect and care for each other sitting at a table in an airport lounge. "The contract," Dorothy said. "Thomas Whitfield." "I already told you what I think," Avery said. "Tell me again." Avery looked at her. "I think we review it on its merits, which is what we were already doing. Thomas's work is good and his firm is reliable, and his brother's behavior at an airport has no bearing on whether his logistics proposal serves Meridian's interests." She paused. "But I also think that if Thomas Whitfield wants to preserve any chance of working with us, the next 48 hours are going to tell me more about his character and his judgment than the last 18 months of presentations." Dorothy nodded. "Don't cancel the contract to punish the brother," she said. "And don't protect it to shield the brother. Review it honestly." "That's what I said. I know. I wanted to say it myself." Dorothy looked at her phone on the table between them and then at Avery. "Layla called." "How is she?" "She's Layla," Dorothy said with the particular warmth that came into her voice every time she said her granddaughter's name. The warmth of a woman who has watched something she loves grow into itself. She wanted to drive to Chicago. "I told her to stay in New York and I would be on the next flight." A small pause. "She asked me if I had known the whole time." Avery raised an eyebrow. She had seen the video by the time she called, Dorothy said. "She's sharp enough to put together that the airline CEO showing up at the gate was not a coincidence." Dorothy was quiet for a moment, turning her teacup slightly in her hands. "I told her I was just a person who knows people." "Is that true?" Dorothy looked at her. "I'm 31% of an airline, and I'm a grandmother who wanted to sit by the window and watch the planes and not be bothered." She picked up her tea. "Both things are true simultaneously." Avery smiled the specific quiet smile of a woman who has worked closely with someone for 5 years and still occasionally encounters something in that person that is better than she expected. Dorothy's phone lit up with an incoming call. She looked at the screen. "It's Layla again. Answer it," Avery said. Dorothy answered and held the phone to her ear, and her face did the thing it did only when Layla was on the line, which was that it became something that had nothing to do with airlines or history or the particular weight of a 76-year-old woman's authority, and became simply the face of a grandmother who loves her grandchild without calculation or condition. "I'm fine, baby," Dorothy said. "I'm in the lounge. I have tea." She listened. "Yes, I know you saw the video. I know Aunt Karen shared it. Your Aunt Karen and I are going to have a conversation about that at some point." She listened again, and a small smile began. "No. I did not know who he was. I knew who I was. That was enough." She listened for a long time, and during that time her expression moved through several things that were not for anyone else to see, and then she said very softly, "Baby, I am going to be at your graduation tomorrow morning. That is the only thing you need to think about right now." A pause. I kept my seat. "I'll tell you the rest when I see you." She put the phone down. She looked at Avery. "She's going to be a wonderful lawyer," she said. "I know," Avery said. "She comes from someone who knows how to hold her ground." Dorothy was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that she said quietly and without drama, in the tone of someone who has made peace with a thing and is simply stating where they have arrived. Harold would have thought all of this was very funny. Avery looked at her. He always said that the best test of a company's character was how it treated people who couldn't do anything for it. She looked at the window at the Meridian plane that was still at its gate outside. He would have laughed at the idea that a man in a suit tried to move me out of a chair and accidentally introduced himself to 31% of the company he was trying to work with. A pause. He would have laughed, and then he would have said, "Now what are you going to do with it?" And Avery said. Dorothy turned back to look at her. "And I'm going to get on a flight to New York and watch my granddaughter graduate from law school," she said. "That's what I'm going to do with it." Priscilla Huang came to the lounge at 10:15 with a boarding pass printed on crisp paper, and she handed it to Dorothy across the small table, in the way you hand something to someone when the handing of it is an act of repair rather than transaction, both hands carefully, like the thing being transferred matters. "First class," Priscilla said. "Direct to LaGuardia, no additional charge." She hesitated, and then she said the thing she had been composing in her head for the last 90 minutes. "I want to apologize. For the whole morning. I should have done more sooner before it got to where it got." Dorothy looked at her with those clear gray eyes. "You did something," she said. "You pressed the button, you sent the messages, you used the authority you had." She held Priscilla's gaze. "Don't apologize for what you couldn't do. Acknowledge what you did do and learn the rest for next time." Priscilla nodded. Her throat moved. "Your granddaughter's going to be very lucky to have you in that audience tomorrow." Dorothy folded the boarding pass and put it in her handbag and said, "She earned the audience. I'm just going to be there." Back in Gate 22, or what remained of it, a much reduced crowd. Now most of the passengers redistributed to other flights or other gates or the customer service queue. A small cluster of people were still present when Dorothy and Avery walked back through Renata Wells, waiting for her own rebooking to resolve, and Gary Pollard, who had been rebooked but had not yet left, and Priya Suresh, who had nowhere to be for another hour, and who had put her phone in her bag because the story had moved past what she could add to it. Renata stood when she saw Dorothy, not with the formality of ceremony, but with the simple impulse of a woman who wanted to be on her feet for this. "Safe travels," she said, and there was more than that in the two words, and both women knew it. Dorothy looked at her. "You stood up," she said. "Not for me. Because it was right. That matters more than you might think it does. Renata said I had a student years ago. Something happened to her in front of the class, and I didn't step in fast enough, and I have thought about it every year since." She held Dorothy's gaze. "Today, I got one back." Dorothy put her hand briefly on Renata's, just for a moment, the lightest touch, and then she moved on. Gary Pollard raised one hand in a nod that said more than a longer gesture would have the nod of a man who does not traffic in speeches and does not need to. Dorothy returned it in kind. Priya Suresh looked up from where she was sitting and opened her mouth and then closed it again. And then she said, "I'm sorry for filming without asking you first." Dorothy stopped. She looked at Priya with something that was evaluative and warm simultaneously, the look of a woman sizing up a young person she has decided has something worth seeing. "You documented the truth," she said. "Don't apologize for that." 270,000 people watched it, Priya said. Dorothy considered this for a moment. Then, 270,000 people know what the truth looks like, she said. That is not a small thing. Avery waited near the gate entrance. She did not rush this. She had flown here for Dorothy, and she would leave when Dorothy was ready to leave and not before. The boarding announcement for Dorothy's flight came over the gate speaker, the clean, professional voice of an airline doing what it does best, moving people from one place to another as reliably and safely as possible. And Dorothy stood up straight, the way she always stood, and smoothed the front of her coat, and settled the strap of her handbag over her wrist. And she was 76 years old, and her left hand trembled, its quiet, faithful tremor at her side, and she looked exactly as she had looked when she sat down in this gate at 6:17 in the morning, and she looked like someone who had not been moved. She said goodbye to Avery at the gate entrance, not a long goodbye, because their goodbyes never were. They had too much history and too much respect for each other to inflate their partings, and Avery said, "Call me when you land," and Dorothy said, "I'll call you after the graduation," and that was the whole of it. She walked to the jetway without looking back, the way she always walked toward what was next. Her handbag in both hands, her step unhurried, and every person who watched her go would remember afterward the particular quality of that walk. The walk of a woman who had been told to move and had not moved, and who was now moving entirely on her own terms, in her own direction, at her own pace, because that was the only way she had ever moved through a world that had been telling her where to go since before she was old enough to answer back. She did not look back. She never looked back. The first-class seat was wide and still and smelled faintly of clean fabric and recirculated air, and Dorothy May Caldwell sat in it with her handbag on her knee and the third-quarter operations report open on her lap, making her small, careful notations in the margins with a ballpoint pen, while the O'Hare tarmac shrank below her and then disappeared into clouds. Outside, somewhere in the gray October sky above Chicago, a Meridian Airways plane was climbing on a parallel course, navy blue, with a white stripe, heading east. As she was heading east, as Harold had always said, they would always, east, always forward, always toward what they had decided to build. Her left hand trembled, and she kept writing. In a Delta business class seat in a middle row with no window view, Brad Whitfield sat with his laptop open and the cursor unmoving on a document he could not write, and he read his brother's text for the 5th time. "I don't want to talk tonight." And he put the phone face down and looked at the seat in front of him and thought for the first time in a life spent moving quickly toward things about what it costs to have never once stopped to look at what you were moving past. At LaGuardia. Arrivals terminal, Layla Caldwell Torres stood with her arms already open because she had been watching the flight tracker for an hour, and she knew the gate, and she knew the timing, and she had positioned herself perfectly the way Dorothy had always taught her, that preparation was how you show love to the people you are expecting. When Dorothy came through the doors, small and upright and exactly herself, Layla said, Grandma and Dorothy walked into those arms and held on, and when Layla whispered, "I kept your seat in the front row for the graduation tomorrow," Dorothy laughed a real laugh, surprised out of her, and said, "Good girl. That's exactly right. If this story moved you, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell us where are you watching from and what would you have done in that gate.